Hello, everybody. Let me first start by apologizing for doing my presentation this way. I was hoping I would do it live, but due to unavoidable circumstances, I have to do it this way. I am grateful and honored to be invited to talk a bit about a topic that's close to my heart. And I started getting interested in this topic when I did an internship in Washington, D.C., and attended a seminar where one of the speakers said that 50% of women in Kenya undergo female circumcision. And having been born and raised in Kenya, I thought that the statistics were not correct because much less practice this ritual. During a break, I went to the speaker and told her that I thought that statistics were wrong. And without missing a beat, she told me, why don't you go and do your own research and come back and give us your results? And I took that as a challenge, and I've been learning about this procedure over the years. Now, what I will look at today very briefly is just the history, so a very brief history of the practice. And of course, before the history, I'll just do a definition. And then I'll look at the evolution of the practice and how it started to create awareness to the international community. The World Health Organization defines female circumcision as all procedures involving partial or total removal of the external genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs for non-medical reasons. This ritual or this removal of the external genitalia is further classified into 4 different types, with type 3 being the most severe, also known as infibulation, and the least severe being type 4, which includes pricking, piercing, or scraping. Some researchers have traced the practice to Egypt way back in the 2nd century BC, so before Christ and also before Islam, when a geographer wrote about female circumcision as it occurred among the tribes residing on the western coast of the Red Sea. Studies also state that there is a 5th century BC Egyptian mummy who shows that women were infibulated, and this is also supported by a Greek papyrus in the British Museum dated 163 BC. Studies also show that the Romans used infibulation to prevent their slaves from having sexual intercourse and from bearing children, therefore making them more economically valuable as slaves. As recently as 1950s and 1960s, clitoridectomy which is type 1 of the female circumcision, was practiced in Western Europe and the United States to treat different kinds of ailments in women, like hysteria, epilepsy, and even masturbation and lesbianism. Globally, we now see that about 92 countries across the world have communities that practice some form of female circumcision. And almost 100 million women, not almost, but actually over 100 million women and young girls living today have experienced some form of female circumcision, with millions more being affected annually. Now, if we look at the evolution and how this practice was brought to the forefront of the international community, I'll start with the fact that this practice was normal in different parts of Africa before the colonizers started settling. Now, when the colonizers started settling, they realized that the communities had different kinds of cultures, including female circumcision. I'll give an example of central Kenya, where the social cultural context of both male and female sexuality was looked at in both circumcision and land ownership. The male sexuality was conceptualized through land ownership. And so if you had land and you were circumcised, it was considered that you were an adult male. Similarly, if you were circumcised as a woman, then you were conceptualized as being an adult. When the colonizers came, without asking about the culture, they started taking the land to themselves. And they took most of the land, and this forced the communities to be confined into small reserved areas. Of course, without land, a man could not fully attain manhood. What's funny is that the colonizers also, through their churches, started schools in the late 1920s. And in 1929, they started banning children whose parents did not renounce female circumcision, which was at the time considered a barbaric custom. So suddenly, they were concerned with culture. Opposition to this ban made the communities themselves create their own schools, which would allow the custom to continue. And in 1956, the practice was considered to be illegal. But almost immediately, in defiance of the ban, adolescent girls bought razor blades and went to the forests to circumcise themselves. Now, the current wave of feminist interest in female circumcision did not begin till 1976, when Fran Hosken, who was born in Vienna and later migrated to the United States, began writing about the practice in her newsletter titled Women's International Network News. Beginning in 1973, she traveled extensively in Africa, documenting the way it was practiced. Her report on female circumcision was published in 1979, and it was very influential in persuading the international community, including World Health Organization, to make efforts to end the practice. Hosken also coined the term female genital mutilation to replace the term female circumcision. Hosken persisted and even confronted a Somalian delegate at a Habitat conference in Vancouver and led a letter-writing campaign to hospitals and health clinics in Africa. Her campaign grew throughout the 1970s and gained the support of outspoken African women, enabling her to publish the Hosken Report in 1979. Soon, the United Nations agencies like the World Health Organization took up the issue, the UN subcommittees began to study it, and feminists came to see the practice as a tool of patriarchy and a symbol of women's subordination. Female circumcision became known in the 1970s also after people from Africa escaped to the UK. Efua Dorkeno, who was born in Ghana and also one of the people who migrated to the UK, studied nursing and was sparked into action after taking a midwifery class in the 1970s. She saw firsthand the difficulties that a young woman who had undergone infibulation faced with childbirth. There were no policies or protocols on how to take care of women who had undergone female circumcision then. The medical practitioners were not familiar with the practice. Dorkeno coordinated a small group of UK-based women known as the Women's Action Group of Female Excision and Infibulation, or in short WAGFE, who were concerned about female circumcision. The group was under the auspices of Minority Rights Group, a London-based international human rights organization. Just before the formation of the group, Minority Rights Group, or MRG, published the first report on female circumcision titled Female Circumcision, Excision, and Infibulation: The Facts and Proposals for Change. MRG hoped to increase awareness on the subject and to stimulate support for people working towards eradication of the practice. The report received overwhelming attention from both the UK and international press, and many people sent contributions to support those who were fighting the practice. The report was also published in other languages, and copies were distributed in Europe and in Africa. Dokeno gathered facts about this practice, which she then presented to the UN Commission on Human Rights. The facts she gathered were later collated into a revised MRG report, and in this report, recommendations were also given for future actions. The report also placed female circumcision on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Commission as a human rights issue. The publication evoked media interest and led to the first BBC documentary on female circumcision. The documentary was shot in Sudan in 1982 and appeared in the BBC's 45 Minutes program in 1983. The documentary provided the health complications associated with severe forms of female circumcision for the first time and aroused major interest in the subject of the British and international public and among members of the House of Lords. As a research and information human rights charity, MRG could not take the work on female circumcision any further. So Dokeno, who was still interested in the work, founded the Foundation for Women's Health Research and Development Organization, also known as Forward, and made female circumcision a central focus of this group. This was a small group of dedicated UK and Africa-based women whose initial aim was broadly to promote awareness to counter traditional practices prejudicial to the health of women and children. Forward was at the forefront of the campaign to have female circumcision criminalized in the UK as well. By the 1980s, female circumcision was condemned widely in the Western popular and scholarly press, variously labeled as a crime of gender, torture, barbarism, or ritualized torture. Reports on this practice have led to a variety of legislative and legal responses in Western countries. The transnational campaigns, however, failed to include communities that practice it, and African women boycotted a female circumcision panel during one of the UN conferences on women in 1980. These tensions exemplify the struggle between what we now know as cultural relativism and universal human rights. Universal human rights or universalism asserts that everyone is linked together by a common cause that is human rights, which are universal, and there's no cultural value for the practice of female circumcision because values change from place to place and over time. So some of the rituals of practice can actually be changed. Cultural relativists, on the other hand, oppose conforming to universal norms, arguing that majority preference should not dictate what is moral because there's no particular culture that is superior to another when examining issues of law, politics, or morality. Recent efforts at official international level, particularly by the UN agencies, have successfully put female circumcision on women's health and human rights agendas as a health hazard and a form of violence against women. The observations and recommendations of the various UN monitoring committees, such as the one established under Women's Convention, are considered to be of particular value since they monitor national compliance of different states with international human rights treaties. Another example is the Committee on the Rights of the Child. This committee held that the deportation of a Somali mother and her baby daughter, fearing to undergo female circumcision, would breach Denmark's obligation to protect the child from all forms of physical or mental violence. However, the views of this committee, as well as other committees, are not legally binding. Nations that are parties to these committees are required to submit reports on a periodic basis to document their compliance on the statements issued by the committees interpreting human rights instruments to prohibit human violations like female circumcision. Several countries have ratified these different international laws, and some have also enforced national laws that criminalize female circumcision. However, Scholars argue that the creation of these international laws impose no punishment for disobedience and are therefore ineffective. There are few countries where female circumcision cases have been actively prosecuted. An example of this is France. One reason that this is given is that mainly victims, both victims and perpetrators of the practice, are insulated within their own communities and often do not want to report it. For example, a child will not want to report her parents. Another reason given for the non-implementation is that female circumcision is practiced in remote places where governments have no easy access. Nevertheless, statistics by the UN have shown a decline of the practice in different countries, but do not really state whether the change in legislation is the reason for this decline. So, as stated before, states can be held responsible for failing to take steps to enable women and girls to enjoy and secure the human rights that protect them from female circumcision. To this end, the practice can give rise to refugee status. But it turns out that states generally do not see it this way. Some European countries denied asylum to applicants who were afraid of going back to their respective countries where they would undergo female circumcision, and the European Court of Human Rights actually upheld these judgments. So what this means is that the women who face danger in their home countries cannot rely on the legal protection that was created to protect them in the first place. What I've learned over the years is that the more I learn about this practice, the more I view it as plural, not a fixed meaning that is often attached to the cutting. This heterogeneity is echoed in the various forms that female circumcision takes, which includes diverse ethnicities, thus multitudes of intersectionality. Through my research in Kisii, Kenya, one of the communities that practice female circumcision and where this practice is prevalent, I realized that involving the women in the community as well as the men is very important. I've learned that people in these communities have their own way of working to overcome female circumcision, along with other issues that they face on a daily basis, because this practice is integrally linked to economic, political, social realities of every day. They should therefore be allowed to voice their own views. More importantly, as I continue learning, I continue having questions. Some of the questions I have, for example, are the proposals for less extensive or medicalized cutting condoning child abuse, as well as violation to women willing to undercut efforts to end female circumcision? Or are they compassionate, pragmatic compromise solutions intended to protect the health of girls and women? Are zero-tolerance platforms safeguarding the human rights of girls and women, or staunchly defending a moral high ground at any cost? And what happens to the women who've already undergone these practices? What's more important is that I've learned that we need to give space for women and men in these communities that practice female circumcision to express themselves and let their voices be heard. After all, sometimes the most convincing and fierce opponents of these practices are the ones who've undergone it. Thank you for your attention.